So in today's passage, we meet a very important person in the New Testament world that we are introduced to as a person named Saul. Now, Saul will actually go on to become Paul, and Paul would actually go on to write, frankly, a majority of the New Testament. Everything from after Acts starts with Romans. Everything from Romans to Philemon are all letters attributed to Paul. And Paul is the one who really creates, takes the stories of Jesus and starts to construct an actually kind of more concrete theology of Jesus. And he writes some really rich and amazing and important things. He was a profound evangelist and is really the one responsible more than anybody else for taking the good news that Christ came to proclaim outside of just Israel and Judea and started taking it to all these other places, including to the Gentiles, including to people who were not already part of the Jewish tradition but followed other traditions. Paul was the one who brought Jesus and brought this message to them. We really owe what we have and what we inherit as the modern church to Paul. But Paul doesn't start out as Paul. Paul starts out as Saul, and the Saul that we're introduced here is part of that Jewish tradition, as Paul, as he will always be. But he's part of a very specific part of it. Paul is a Pharisee, and he's not even really a Pharisee. He goes on to say in some of his letters, he was the Pharisee of Pharisees. He was incredibly zealous as a Pharisee, and didn't come from Jerusalem itself, actually came from another community outside of Jerusalem that was known for its intellectualism and for its culture. And Saul really takes on this role almost as like enforcer, right? If you are doing something that is any way outside the bounds of what the Pharisees thought were appropriate, the one you didn't want knocking on your door was Saul. And you can see, you see in Jesus' own story how many times he tangles with the Pharisees and the scribes and these other religious leaders, and how much trouble he gets into it for it. It's ultimately really what lands him in a position of being crucified in the first place, was the fact that he took on these religious leaders. Well, Saul is one of those religious leaders, and in fact, an incredibly, very honestly, violent one. He is present at several stonings of early Christians. He authorizes, frankly, the murder of early Christians and early disciples, and goes on a spree of persecution. He arrests people. He sends them back to Jerusalem, and when Paul gets up in the morning, on the morning that we read today, that's what he's intending to do, right? He's going out to persecute people who are followers of the way, which is how Christians were originally known. We were followers of the way of Christ, because frankly, that's what our faith is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a way of living. So early on, we were called followers of the way. So Paul has been doing this work in Jerusalem, and in fact doing it very effectively, to the point that many early followers of Christ have actually fled, and they're heading out to the areas around and into the countryside. So that's where Paul is. He's on the road to Damascus. He's on the road to go find and root out other followers of Jesus who may have left Jerusalem and traveled to those places. So when Paul gets up in the morning, Paul, whichever, gets up in the morning, he is an incredibly powerful person. On his word, he can imprison people and send them back to Jerusalem. On his word alone, he can order people killed. So Paul wakes up in that morning and he has all of the power. He is one of the most powerful, important, and influential people there is, period. Literally carrying the power of life and death in his hands. And so he hands down this road on his way to see if there's other people that he needs to deal with. And instead, he's struck blind, right? There's a light from heaven. He's struck blind. And while Paul started the day as one of the most powerful people there is, Paul ends the day not even able to make it to his destination without help. It said his companions had to help carry him to where he needed to go. Now, God doesn't need to change Paul's calling. Paul will always understand himself as being God's servant and doing God's work. What Saul needs to do is change the direction he is going and the way he is going about that work in a very dramatic way. And he's going to make that change, first and foremost, by going through this period of weakness and vulnerability. Now, many people have lived through an experience like that. There's actually somebody in our congregation that, frankly, I believe knows that better than probably most of us ever will. And so for today, I wanted to sit down and have a conversation with him. So here is part of the conversation that we had together. As it happens, we actually have someone in our church who has experience in some of the things that we were talking about today. And of course, I'm talking about our own Van Duvall, who is I believe, lifelong member of the church.
No, not quite.
Not quite. Close to.
Close to.
Close to. Also serves with his wife, Christy, as our co-youth leaders, and has himself experienced maybe not something exactly akin to what the Apostle Paul went to, but something close. So Van, would you start off by just explaining a little bit what happened to you about 3 years ago for those who might not know?
Yeah, so January of 2017, after the holidays, back at work, and you know, I'm feeling good about life. I'm fit, I'm healthy, and just one day at work, a excruciating pain started in my abdomen, and didn't know what it was, just thought something might pass, might go away. And that was a Friday afternoon. And so I saw the doctor the next day on a Saturday and got x-rays, and the doctor said, well, just kind of watch it. Looks like you have a blockage, it'll pass. And then I couldn't wait, couldn't sleep, I was in too much pain. Early that next Monday morning, my wife takes me to NCMC, and to the emergency room, and they of course sedate me, and I'm feeling good at that point, and that's the last thing I remember about that. That's the last memory I have before waking up 3 weeks later. And I found out one of my intestines was twisted, and the surgeon takes out that section and sews me back up and sends me into septic shock. The first thing I remember is Jim Young, Christy's dad, and Christy leaning in front of me, just urging me to fight. Come on, fight, you got this. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, yeah, I'm getting out of the hospital today. I'm good. Little did I know. One of the things I noticed when I woke up was my left foot was just black, just done, as well as all the toes on my right foot, and tips, different lengths of 7 fingers. They performed other surgeries on me, my amputations, and that's when I really went into deep depression. And you know, up until then, I had my mind was, I'm getting back to work. I mean, this isn't going to stop me. Heart and lungs are working well, but kidneys and bladder, no. So I'm on dialysis, and that really hurt me, because I'm like, I could not be on dialysis the rest of my life. And just praying, and just, I guess maybe just the force of will, I said, okay, let's start working one day. And slowly the kidneys came back, and I got off of dialysis, and I so realized not to take for granted anything that our body does for us. Fast forward to today, I'm feeling a lot better, not 100%. I'm stronger, but not all the way where I want to be. But it's continuing day by day. It's a continuing road, and I've since taken up talking to a counselor, which my wife and daughters have all pushed me to do, and I was resistant and stubborn and talk about your sermon the other day, being stubborn. That's what I was doing. And I finally decided, let's do this. And it was one of the best things I've ever done during this journey. My surgeon talked to me about it and said the studies they've done on returning soldiers from war and their depression is that the medication maybe takes away 30% of your depression, but they said the number one thing that helps them was talking to a counselor, talking about it. So, yeah, so but here I am, and that was very unexpected. Just.
I think that I'm not sure it was the first time we met, but one of the first times you and I met was in the hospital in one of your subsequent visits of you being there. And thankfully, we haven't had to do that for a while,
that is a blessing.
Which I'm grateful for.
Yes.
So you yourself, you're a veteran. Thank you. You're in law enforcement. I mean, when you take on those sorts of roles, you take on a certain amount of risk with them. But this wasn't related to any of that. Like this was all very unexpected. Did it change things for you because it just felt like it just came out of the blue? It wasn't anything you expected to have happen?
Of course. I mean, as a public servant, I mean that was how I identified. I mean, I was there to help others. Okay, I'm there to serve, and I'm going 100 miles an hour one day, and the next day, complete stop. I couldn't run or do any exercises for a long time. I mean, I can run now, but it's very funny to watch actually, because it's a lot different. But yeah, and it was just out of the blue and unexpected. I mean, you go in for an operation, you would think, okay, I can wake up the next day and I'm great, but no. And that's what made me realize not to take anything for granted, and let's prioritize things. That was the biggest thing. Just the things that I used to worry about were insignificant and meant nothing really, and were just worried that I didn't need to have. So anyway.
Are there ways you maybe actually feel, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but other ways maybe you actually feel stronger now than you were before? I mean, I know physically you're still in a recovery mode, but are there ways you feel stronger now?
Yes, both mentally and physically and emotionally. One of the ways I described it in my recovery is that I almost feel more empowered now than I did before, because of how I'm inspiring people, and obviously that's not something I did one day. I want to inspire people. Let me lose my leg. No, I just had so many people coming up to me saying, "Van, you're amazing," and I'm like, well, thank you. I'm doing what I can to the best of my ability, and I guess it's such an inspiration to people to see me fight and work hard and to come back and get back to the best normal life that I can get to. And it was just an honor hearing people tell me what an inspiration I am. And I think that is one of my new journeys, my new path now, is to use this to inspire people that are going through similar things. And I have since I got out of the hospital, I've been invited back to talk to people in similar situations and say, hey, you're going to get through this. A guy I work with at the sheriff's office had an injury to his leg that made him need an amputation. I went in before his operation and talked to him about it, showed him what's going on with me, told him my situation, have talked to him since. Just doing things like that. I'm now on the peer support team at the sheriff's office, providing support for anybody for any reason. So, also, a while back, I was just sitting around thinking, what can I do as part of this journey to help others now in this role? So I thought, well, maybe I can just start a like almost like our working men's group, but just something for law enforcement or first responders, veterans, support group. Just maybe a nonprofit. And so I have started the beginning steps of creating a nonprofit called Heroes Support to support our heroes. And what my goal that I see that doing is supporting them financially, emotionally, mentally, just in whatever way they need. So
I don't want to, again, I hate to put words in your mouth, but at first I feel like I want to say, it sounds like through this maybe you found a new calling, but maybe not so much, only because you said before your calling was to serve. You've joined the military, you joined the sheriff's department as a way of serve. So maybe it's not so much you found a new calling, but you've definitely found new ways to serve.
Yes, definitely new ways to serve. And you're right, it isn't exactly a new calling, but it is, I think, what I've done in the military and the sheriff's office is very meaningful, but this is, I think, even more meaningful. It's just a humanitarian thing, it's something that I think everybody needs. I mean, you don't have to be an amputee to need inspiration. You can just, maybe your pet bird died or something, and that was devastating to you. I mean, it could be anything. It is very much a new calling, and I definitely want to use this to be part of my journey after the sheriff's office and continue this.
So right now, with everything going on in the world, I'm sure there are folks who would think that a lot of folks feel that they're probably living through some of the darkest times they've been through, being separated from our families, separated from our lives. Many people have lost jobs, and all of that. I think I'd be interested to know where are you finding hope right now, either both in your life personally or with everything else going on. Where would you say your hope is coming from?
I found hope from that moment I woke up in the hospital when I was being told to fight. And all the outpouring and sentiment of gifts and cards and donations to help me and my family, I found hope in that. And an uncle of ours from Arkansas, a retired doctor, his name's Mike, was at the hospital with me, and he challenged me one day, and he said, or one night, he was staying with me during the night. He looks at me and says, "Van, do you want this?" And he was making me make a choice whether I wanted to live or die. And I said, "Yeah, I do." And I found hope in that. And I mean, that was a dark time. But there's hope in my family and the support I got from them. I was looking forward to seeing them every day. I mean, that was just the highlight of my day, and in the hospital, and still every day, even out of the hospital, I should say. But hope, and from the congregation's love and my coworkers, just amazing. Of course, I find hope in God and in Christ, and I prayed before this happened, and it just taught me to have stronger faith. I mean, a lot of people are like, "Aren't you mad at God? I mean, isn't your faith gone?" I'm like, no, it's stronger. It's stronger now. We're supposed to be happy when we have trials and obstacles. Pray to God and be thankful and happy in those. And I kept that in my mind, and my faith got stronger, and I prayed more, and I realized that maybe I worked on not being so selfish in my life, but I think I probably was, and I'm working on being more giving. But I find hope in all those areas. I mean,
Well, this whole sermon series has been about, where do we find God? Where in the world is God? And I think you're right. And one of the things we kept coming back through in this whole thing is this: there's a choice, which is when we ask that question, we can ask it in despair or we can ask it in hope, right? And an expectation that God is going to show up. And I think, in many of the things you talked about and shared about the people and the cards and the medical care and everything else, I mean, it's a choice whether you want to see God, and the Holy Spirit working in those situations. I certainly do, and it sounds like you do too. Well, Van, I have to tell you, one of the places I find hope is in you and in your story, and getting to know you over these last few years and everything, and has been a real pleasure for me, and to see the progress you're making and the dedication to it, and the fact that you did get back to work and that you are doing that, and I'm inspired by the idea that you're turning this into a nonprofit. What a wonderful gift for everybody. So thank you for being part of this, and thank you for sharing your story with us.
Of course. Thank you for having me, and I love sharing my story. It's not only something that I hope inspires people, but it's mental health for me. It's healing for me to share my story, and I love to. Little kids will come up to me and ask, "Hey, what's happened? What happened to your leg?" And their parents might be, "Oh, no, don't ask." And I'm like, it's fine. I love telling my story. I'm glad to, and I'll tell my story, and it's great. So good to share.
Perfect. I really appreciate it. When I said that Van was one of the most inspiring people I've ever met, I really meant it. And the story of what he's gone through and how he's arrived on the other side, I hope you were also inspired by. And Van's story isn't really unlike Paul's. Right? Van found himself in a place where he was made weak and vulnerable, and through that process discovered strength that he didn't know that he had. In many ways, Paul has to go through the same thing. Paul is actually going to be given a much more dangerous and much more important mission by God than he was living out before. And in order to do that, in order for Saul to become the Paul that we all need him to be, he had to go through this period where he was weak and vulnerable so that he could discover the true strength and the true direction that God needed his life to go. Now, most of us will never be asked to go through an experience like Paul went through. Most of us will never be asked to go through an experience like Van went through. But most of us, I dare say all of us, will have times when we are made to feel weak and vulnerable. And we have a choice to make. Similar to the choice Paul had to make, whether he was going to listen to the voice from heaven, similar to the choice that Van had to make if he was going to choose to struggle and to live. When we experience those times, when we feel weak and vulnerable, we have a choice to make too. We can choose to wallow in it. We can choose the path of perhaps self-pity, and for a time, every once in a while, that can feel good. But we can also choose to see that as a time and an opportunity where we are given the ability to dig and perhaps find strength that we didn't even know was there. Physical strength, sure, but perhaps it's also about mental strength, spiritual strength, the chance to really develop those parts of ourselves as well. Because the truth is, God has a calling on each of our lives. God has work that he wants all of us to be a part of. And Jesus was very clear about this when he said that your most important task, the most important commandment is what? Love God, love your neighbor, and love yourself. And sometimes those are really hard to do. So as we all go through this time where it feels like everything around us has been made weak and vulnerable by things so outside of our control, we have a choice. We can complain about it. We can pity ourselves and others over it, or we can use it as an opportunity to dig down and perhaps find strength we didn't even know was there. Strength that at the end of the day doesn't even belong to us, but it's the strength that we all receive through God and through the Holy Spirit. That reserve, that endless reserve of hope, that endless reserve of grace, that endless reserve of forgiveness And yes, that endless reserve of strength that we all need, not because we're so impressive and not because we're so special, but because God is, and because we get to be God's beloved children. Amen.